Reform versus reality. Inside the fight to change America's women's prisons. Subscribe now for more authentic crime tales. Remember to like, share, and engage with us in the comments below. The shouting started just after dawn. Inside California's Central Valley Women's Facility, hundreds of inmates pounded on metal doors, their voices echoing through concrete walls. Guards rushed down the corridors, shouting for order. But the women weren't fighting each other. They were protesting. Overnight, the prison's new reform program had been suspended. The mental health workshops, the mother-child video calls, even the art therapy sessions, all canceled. "What happened to the promises?" one woman screamed. "You said we mattered now." The chaos spread from one block to another. Inmates threw paper cups and slammed their trays on the floor, the noise sounding like thunder. One officer's voice came through the loudspeaker. "Return to your bunks immediately." But no one moved. The women stood together, furious, hungry, and betrayed. Then came the sound that froze everyone, a loud crash from the West Wing. A door had been forced open. Somewhere inside that wing, an inmate had collapsed. Within minutes, paramedics rushed in. The air smelled of bleach and fear. A camera from a local news crew, already outside covering prison reform efforts, captured the flashing lights as the stretcher rolled out. On it was Maria Torres, 38 years old, a woman who had become the face of prison reform just a year before. She wasn't moving. The reporters whispered among themselves. How could this happen in a facility praised for progress? How could a program built to heal end in tragedy? And as Maria's body disappeared into the waiting ambulance, one question hung in the morning air. Had the fight for reform gone too far, or not far enough? A year earlier, Maria Torres was standing in the same yard, smiling under the warm California sun. She'd been serving a 5-year sentence for drug possession, a low-level offense tied to years of addiction and trauma. When state lawmakers launched a pilot program to improve mental health and rehabilitation for women, Maria volunteered immediately. She wasn't alone. Hundreds of women signed up. The reform promised something different: therapy, education, and opportunities to reconnect with family. For the first time, many inmates said they felt human again. But behind the scenes, the program struggled. Budgets were tight. Staff were overwhelmed. Some officers quietly resented the new rules, saying they made their jobs harder. And outside the prison, not everyone supported the reforms. Critics argued that money was being wasted on people who didn't deserve it. Still, inside those walls, hope was growing. Maria started leading group sessions, encouraging other women to believe in change. "Reform isn't a dream," she said during a local news interview. "It's survival." But soon after that broadcast aired, problems started again: sudden meal shortages, canceled visits, and whispered warnings from staff. Something about the program's funding had changed. And then, one night, Maria disappeared from her block for nearly 2 hours. When she returned, her friends said she looked shaken, whispering, "They're trying to shut us down." 2 days later, the protests began. And by sunrise, Maria Torres would be on that stretcher, silent, cold, and at the center of a storm that was only just beginning. The morning after Maria Torres was carried out on a stretcher, the prison buzzed with whispers. No one knew exactly what had happened, but rumors spread fast. Some said Maria had collapsed from exhaustion. Others whispered she'd been found in solitary, unresponsive. The warden, David Keller, held a brief press conference outside the gates, his voice tight and rehearsed. "There was a medical emergency," he said. "We are cooperating fully with the state investigation. The facility remains secure." But reporters pressed for more. "Was Maria Torres part of the reform program?" one asked. Keller hesitated, then replied, "Yes, but this had nothing to do with the reforms." Inside, the women weren't convinced. They'd seen the warning signs for weeks: missing therapy sessions, cutbacks in food, guards confiscating notebooks from their mental health groups. Maria had been one of the few brave enough to question the changes. She'd written letters to the prison board and even managed to get one published by a local newspaper. The headline had read, "Reform or Illusion? Life inside California's women's prisons." Now she was gone, and silence filled the halls where laughter used to echo. 3 days later, reform advocates gathered outside the prison. Among them was Angela Rivers, Maria's older sister, who held a photo of her smiling sibling taped to a poster board. Maria believed in the system, she told reporters. She believed change was possible. But what happened to her shows the truth. Reform looks good on paper, but reality is breaking people. The protest drew national attention. News outlets replayed clips of Maria's last interview, her hopeful voice saying, "We're not asking for freedom. We're asking for dignity." Behind closed doors, investigators from the California Department of Corrections reviewed Maria's case file. They discovered something troubling. On the night before her collapse, the prison had been placed on a partial lockdown. All reform activities had been halted indefinitely, following a budget review. Emails showed confusion among staff. One supervisor wrote, "We weren't told to stop the mental health meds, but the order came down to suspend non-essential services. We did what we were told." Another replied, "I warned them this would cause panic." When investigators tried to interview officers from Maria's block, 2 refused. Another said quietly, "She knew too much." Meanwhile, inside the facility, tensions kept rising. Without their programs, many women felt lost again. Fights broke out over food and space. One inmate described the nights as a storm waiting to happen. And then, on the 5th night after Maria's death, that storm finally hit. A fire alarm blared at 2 a.m. The West Wing filled with smoke. Guards rushed in, thinking it was another protest, but it wasn't. A mattress had been set on fire. On the floor near the blaze, someone had written a message in chalk. "Reform is dead." As the prison went into lockdown once more, news cameras gathered outside. The world was now watching, and the truth about what was happening inside America's women's prisons was about to be exposed in a way no one could ignore. By the next morning, smoke stains still marked the cell walls. The air inside the California Central Valley Women's Facility was thick with fear. Every woman knew what came next. Lockdown meant no phone calls, no visits, and no programs. Reform was officially over. Outside, the fire had sparked a media storm. News vans lined the road for miles, their satellite dishes pointed toward the gray prison walls. "This facility was supposed to be the future of women's incarceration," said one anchor live on air. "Now it's a symbol of failure." At the heart of the storm was Angela Rivers, Maria Torres' sister. She wasn't backing down. Angela filed a formal complaint with the state, demanding a full investigation into her sister's death and the shutdown of the reform program. She began appearing on morning shows, holding up Maria's old prison journal, pages filled with drawings, poems, and detailed notes about the program's struggles. One page stood out. It read, "Reform can't survive where silence lives." Meanwhile, state investigators quietly widened their probe. They found that funds meant for mental health care and education inside the women's facility had been diverted to cover staffing shortages and security overtime. In other words, the money for reform had been swallowed by the system it was supposed to fix. When questioned, Warden David Keller denied wrongdoing. "We followed the guidelines," he said during a state hearing. "We did the best we could with what we had." But one of his own officers, speaking anonymously, told investigators a darker truth. When the protests started, Keller was told to make an example. Programs were canceled to show control. Maria wouldn't stop asking questions. She became a problem. The words hit Angela like a punch. Her sister's death wasn't an accident. It was the price of speaking out. As evidence piled up, lawmakers in Sacramento called for emergency hearings. Reform advocates, psychologists, and former inmates filled the room. One by one, they told their stories. Women denied medication, mothers losing contact with their kids, and therapists forced to leave because the funding dried up. It was no longer just about one prison. Similar reports were surfacing in Texas, Illinois, and Florida, reform projects that started strong, then quietly fell apart. By the time Angela took the microphone, the room had fallen silent. Her voice trembled at first, but her words cut through the air. "My sister believed in the promise of change," she said. But what she found was neglect disguised as progress. If this is what reform looks like, Then we need to start over, for every woman who's still in there, and for every family still waiting for justice. Cameras flashed as her speech went viral overnight. Hashtags spread across social media. Hashtag reform versus reality. Hashtag justice for Maria. Hashtag fix the system. Back at the prison, the remaining women watched the broadcast through the flickering light of an old TV in the rec room. For the first time in months, they smiled. Someone had finally heard them. But as the camera panned across the faces of the inmates, a guard turned off the screen. "Back to your cells," he said sharply. The women walked away quietly, but this time, they didn't feel defeated. Because beyond those cold walls, the world was listening. And the real fight for reform was just beginning.